Hi, my name is Kyle Sittig. I'm a PhD student at Michigan State University, and my paper is titled Petro-aesthetics and Petro-temporalities in Lessons of Darkness and Black November. And the goal of this presentation is to read a paper I wrote a little while ago, and then, if there's time, kind of discuss how this is fitting into how I'm conceptualizing of Petro-modernity when it comes to eco-cinema and how that can help us. Anyways, without much further ado, this paper sets out to gauge the possibilities of what I will tentatively call petrocinema aesthetics, using Werner Herzog's 1992 film Lessons of Darkness as its prototype. Oil addresses eco-cinematic questions effectively through its complex relationship to modernity and temporality. Lessons of Darkness itself challenges conventions of both traditional narrative and political documentary. Through its extreme defamiliarization of perspective towards the oil fields of Kuwait in the wake of the Gulf War, the film's ravaged landscape promotes a focus on the more affective, aesthetic properties of its environmental spectacle. From here, I want to bring the framework I construct through a reading of Herzog and past eco-critical scholarship into contact with Jetta Amada's Black November, a more traditional narrative take on oil politics, to reveal the tension points between aesthetics and narrative. Petro-aesthetics and narrative. Andrew Hageman raises a critique of the underlying ideological framework of eco-cinematic films and calls for a dialectical critique of eco-media that would reveal certain elements of environmental ideologies even as others remain obscure. According to Hageman, the ecology to come will inevitably be, quote, an ecology without capital, and the stakes, adding the stakes of our critical work is whether it will be an ecology with or without human beings, unquote. Hageman's theorization of ideology is drawn primarily from Althusser, emphasizing self-critique and a critique of any attempt to stand outside ideology altogether, arguing that to fantasize and act as if in control of ideology is to become even more firmly and unwillingly its tool, its servant, unquote. However, I find Herzog's defamiliarized, almost alien gaze an effective tool for deconstructing environmental and political ideologies, even as its perspective appears to attempt to place itself outside them. Herzog blatantly eschews any political analysis of the Gulf War and its ultimate causes, including the stakes of Western intervention in the Gulf region. In doing so, the war is reduced to broad, poetically charged thematizations of apocalypse, violence, and evil, all set up by the quote Herzog attributes to Pascal at the start of the film: the collapse of the stellar universe will occur like creation in grandiose splendor. Of course, we could critique the ideological dimensions of Herzog's framing of the environment lessons. However, the choice of radical defamiliarization, as if the events of the film are being watched by an alien race, suggests that Herzog is playing with the notion of a truly outside observer in order to heighten the contradictions between problematic notions of environment that pervade ecological film viewing and the construction of oil as a pure subject. Herzog verbalizes an ideological conscience of oil during one of the film's early helicopter shots, which shows that what looks like some coastal buildings now destroyed along with the trees around them. He narrates, "The oil is trying to disguise itself as water." Here Herzog calls attention to the deceptive properties of oil, which always operate as an ecological uncanny, a natural resource that is displaced by technology and becomes a pollutant in the act of its own bringing forth. The aesthetic qualities of oil and its physical reality are consistently mired in such contradictions. Throughout Lessons of Darkness, particularly the film's last half, Herzog focuses on the endless flames of the Kuwaiti oil fields set ablaze during the Iraqi retreat. Robin Murray and Joseph Human touch on the spectacular effects of oil fires in cinema in their book Ecology and Popular Film, arguing that these fires are deliberately ignited to create that because these fires are deliberately ignited to create an environmental disaster of unimaginable proportions, they have no rival as visual presentations. Whether presented in narrative or poetic form, they become all the more spectacular, both because their scope can only be illustrated through sweeping overhead shots from a helicopter and because they are projected onto a large screen, unquote. I would add that the grandeur of the oil fire, as well as the uncontrolled oil spur itself, when unignited, draw the audience into an uncanny feeling, both kinetically infinite as well as cognitively finite. These two threads operate dialectically to draw out the contradictions that emerge between affective viewing pleasure and higher order ecological consciousness. This is, of course, the modus operandi of capitalism altogether. The system always needs to grow, even as such growth is ultimately unsustainable. The notion of Petro-modernity emphasizes this through its implication of modernity's existence as something dependent on finite and rapidly diminishing resources. The very basis of our technological development lacks permanence, despite always representing itself as growing and needing to grow. As such, thinking the material structure of oil lends itself to radical and more complete notions of temporality, what we might call Petro-temporality. And I'm seeing this sort of in terms of what Timothy Morton would call the mesh or hyperobjects. I mean, two separate notions, but both that think about the ways that everything is interconnected and under the surface. Morton's approach is rooted in a commitment to object-oriented ontology that I'm quite a bit less ready to follow. However, the object-oriented approach does prove useful in how I want to theorize the temporality of oil. The origin of fossil fuels in, as Morton puts it, dinosaur bones, breaks down in the earth over spans of time beyond the comprehension of the human mind, and are drawn out of the earth and used up in the span of a couple centuries at a rapidly accelerating rate, not produced again in any meaningful way during our lifetimes. Oil might also fit into the framework of what Morton calls the hyperobject, as I've said, which emphasizes the life of objects that will outlive us by extraordinarily vast amounts of time, not as something that will necessarily outlive us in its current state. We are too committed to using it all up, but as a new beginning for the ruins of our current society, a slow reemergence long after human extinction. To draw this into a petrocinematic structure, it is necessary to construct a cross-section of both the new temporalities of modernity that are bound up in theories of film as well as oil's technological status. Walter Benjamin's analysis of cinema, mass culture, and technology in the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility discusses new temporalities of social life in conjunction with the changing ideological landscape of art in an era of mass reproduction. Benjamin points out the social aspects of the cinematic apparatus, arguing, quote, the function of film is to train human beings in the appreciations and reactions needed to deal with a vast apparatus whose role in their lives is expanding almost daily, unquote. While Benjamin places this vast acceleration within a larger critique of capitalism and the delayed superstructural response of art to industrial modernity, it is hard to ignore the invisible presence of oil underlying it all. Benjamin's analysis catches what environmentalists now call the Great Acceleration on its upswing through its impact on social ecologies. However, it does not include a strong, specific Anthropocene consciousness. Thus, rapidly changing social and productive relations are not brought into conversation with the ecological implications of capitalism. The question for writers who are interested in the petrocinematic is how cinema might adapt to the petrotemporal era of peak oil and technological acceleration's finitude. What's often missed in this often-cited axiom that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism is the implication of those two outcomes. Oil's implication in our modern technological society is massive, yet oil itself is not often thought of in the same vein as many modern technologies. It is a technology that is not built, but brought forth into being. To imagine its end is quite a bit more feasible than to imagine the end of a vast array of consumer goods that are its dependents. Even more challenging to imagine are the radical new social ecologies that will be forced to emerge out of oil's extinction. Through Herzog's narratives and political decontextualization of Lessons of Darkness, he attempts to aesthetically bring us into contact with the oil's end. For the bulk of the final third of the film, firefighters and the employ of Western oil companies are brought into conflict with the seemingly eternal flames of the Kuwaiti oil fields, a conflict that reestablishes the uncanny duality of oil and water that Herzog vocalizes earlier in the film. The attempts to put out the fires with water give the appearance of a Sisyphean struggle. Oil flames hardly register the dousing of water, continually expressing their aesthetic infinitude. The flames are only able to be put out by the use of explosive charges all at once, completing a narrative of petro-temporality. Deploying defamiliarization is notable here for its reduction of modernity to its driving forces, drawing us into a consciousness of its implications. Furthermore, we might think about how the aesthetics and temporalities of oil can put a unique perspective on the unequal distribution of the Anthropocene's impact between the First World and the Global South. In the vein of Rob Nixon's slow violence, the impacts of Petro-modernity are felt much more palpably in areas such as these. The two interviews Herzog conducts with Kuwaiti women reflect this. Herzog's political decontextualization reduces the stories to an essential violence where there can be no justification without beating around the bush. Herzog shows that the ultimate benefactor of this violence is oil. Jeddah Imada's Nollywood thriller Black November, on the other hand, roughly 20 years later, in the wake of further wars in the Middle East and Africa, an economic recession, and a renewed liberal ideology of ecological awareness, attempting to bring some of these aesthetic values to bear on a more explicitly activist cinema through the intersection of petro-aesthetics and conventional, perhaps melodramatic narrative. The film, set in the Niger Delta and roughly based on Nigerian activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, feeds the aesthetics of dialectical imbalance that I have laid out using Herzog, adding a narrative that deals with the tension between the first and third world, as well as a peaceful protest and armed struggle. The tension between first and third world, as well as the tension between peaceful protest and armed struggle. In the vein of many films that are aimed specifically at raising consciousness of an issue, Black November begins with some statistics that involve Nigeria and its oil economy. The first screen reads, Nigeria, population 167 million, world's 7th most populous nation, over 521 recognized languages, ex-British colony. English is the official language and spoken throughout, unquote. After a few seconds, one more line appears reading, quote, 90% of the population lives on less than $2 a day, unquote. The first two sets of lines recognize the importance of scalability on the effect they hope to have on audiences. When we consider an aesthetic of oil in which petro-temporality and the displacement of material resources is the reality, the scalability of these concepts is of the utmost importance. A ranked population makes this number comparable in size to the major world powers that occupy the upper end of that list, particularly China and the United States, in a way that larger numbers do not. Already we can see the film wrestling with the importance of scalability on audience affects, something further reckoned with in the recognition of climate catastrophe that is always displaced physically from certain audiences, but is also displaced in terms of temporality, as the mind struggles to comprehend the material interactions of deep time. The second set of lines dealing with language first recognize the extremely large number of languages spoken in the country, and then invoke the domination of English, contextualizing these numbers within the colonial legacy of the Global South. This is once again a matter of scale, type of scale that materializes the hegemony of the Western world in conflict with the multitude of racial, religious, ethnic, and class boundaries of the region. The statement of low wages at the end works with the next screen that talks about the massive oil output of the region, its pollution as a result, and low life expectancy. Combined, all of these factors engage the intersection of labor, colonialism, global economics, and pollution in a more digestible scale. Immediately following this group of numbers, the film opens on a shot of a crowded Nigerian street rife with poverty. Operating as the initial setup for the film's framed narrative, we see the inside of a prison that Abir, thus far unfamiliar to the audience, at the scene of what will be her eventual execution. In an aesthetic juxtaposition, the next scene is set in downtown Los Angeles. The city is clean, there are high rises and nice cars. There are pedestrians, but in opposition to the scene in Nigeria, there are well-spaced and few in number. A few stark juxtapositions between the two settings are apparent. While we are presumably aware that the United States has a much higher population than Nigeria, when we see the initial numbers, the scene in Nigeria is governed by an aesthetic overpopulation, one of the driving factors behind environmental degradation globally. Obviously, the population of the United States is much more widely dispersed than that of Nigeria. LA in particular is usually governed by visuals that stress the scale as one of the largest cities in America, with huge crowds and stopped traffic. Instead, we get a visualization of comfort and bourgeois decadence in an upscale part of the city. Amada uses this juxtaposition to establish a dichotomy between the world of oil's extraction, the environmentalism of the poor, and the way oil is incorporated into one of the richest cities in the world, becoming invisible. The film asks us to think about the cost of petro-modernity, the way it contributes to massively uneven development of modern life, and how it is, in the language of commodity fetishism, divorced from the conditions of its extraction. Additionally, the use of cars in both scenes is in stark contrast. In Nigeria, one One empty car sits among the crowd of people walking, while in LA they are sleek, moving, and filled with people as the action moves between the shots of the city and the interior of cars. Stephanie Lemenager writes about the aesthetics of cars in terms of oil, touching both on the spectacle of the oil flame as an essential ambivalent relationship between oil and human ecological catastrophe, and the mechanical aspects of modernity complicit in oil through car culture. Quoting Mimi Scheller, Lemenager explains, quote, calls to recognize the body's investments in our, or divestitures from material culture. Scheller argues that any environmental argument against car culture must take into account the affective contexts that are also deeply materialized in particular types of vehicles, homes, neighborhoods, and cities, unquote. Rather than an eager call to use film to effectively disrupt the comfort of its audience by any means necessary, Scheller mines the physical connection people feel to such technologies. Regardless of Scheller's suggestion, the film does pose a challenge to first world comforts when it comes. Sorry, the film does pose a challenge to first world comforts when it makes cars in the tunnel an object of entrapment and claustrophobia, as the militant group in the film traps an oil executive's car, partitioning him off from the relative safety of modern bourgeois society, with oil trucks no less. While narrative events are occurring in the initial scene of Nigeria, they do not register as story events yet, since they are not contextualized. Rather, these scenes have an almost documentary feel. The story begins in LA, with the bleeding into one world from another narratively. So while the film has been framed pedagogically through the opening statistics and the documentary-style footage of Nigeria, has a separate framing inherent in the narrative fiction of the two locations it initially juxtaposes. The thematic focus on peaceful protest and conflict with armed struggle at the heart of Black November is reminiscent of the central question of ecomedia studies. It asks how we can reconcile the ecological price of film and the media production with its goals of ecological and ecocultural awareness. A militant group based on the Niger Delta's MEND engages in industrial sabotage and kidnapping, the goal of which is a spectacle and resultant international attention. In opposition, the main character, Abir, is committed to peaceful protests in line with her Western liberal education. Black November tackles this conflict, perhaps unsatisfyingly, through a reconciliation of the two, where militants use their power to tell her story in an attempt to save her life, revealing a certain futility in both options. In this way, both Black November and Lessons of Darkness reveal a certain absurdity to their situations. Herzog's familiarization asks us to look at the conflict the U.S. is directly involved in with the eyes of a depoliticized observer, while Amada uses his heavy hand to try and raise awareness, and in a meta-narrative gesture acknowledges how hopeless that feels. So that's it for that paper. What I'm interested in, since I got a couple minutes left, and how this project has sort of evolved, is thinking about those notions of temporality and this notion of Petro-modernity and how we might use it to reframe discussions of modernity in film studies, and to think about films that are not necessarily aesthetically oil films like these two films I just talked about,